Okay, so what we're going to cover today, so a little bit about myself and Lysa and a little bit about DSW for those of you who are new to us. We'll give you an overview of the standard, and we'll focus on the individual assessment methods within it. We'll have a look at the grading and the resits and how they work, and then we're going to finish off with some top tips that we've got around kind of planning and delivering and preparing for endpoint assessment, and then, like I say, a bit of time for questions at the end. So about myself, so I'm head of apprenticeships for DSW. I've been with the organisation close to 3 years now, and I really head up our endpoint assessment side of the organisation, which is now the biggest part of DSW. So working very closely with training providers and with employers to understand your requirements and then to build EPA services that meet those requirements and exceed those requirements. So it's a very broad-ranging role that I've got. Everything from quality to product design to client relationship. So no 2 days are the same. But the best part of my job, I think, is doing stuff like this and the build up to doing stuff like this. So working with you guys to understand about how you're going to deliver these programs, what sort of resources are going to make your life easier. And then how do we have that seamless journey for apprentices so that they go through their own program, they know what to expect and how to prepare for their endpoint assessment, and then they have a good experience and hopefully come away with a good grade at the end of it as well. So that's a little bit about me, and I'll allow Lysa to introduce herself now.
So hello, my name's Lysa Morrison. I'm the product specialist on the coaching standard for DSW. So my background is I've been an independent coaching professional since 2007. So our goodness knows how many numbers of individuals I've coached over that period, right the way through from personal development, right the way through to professional development and senior executives, chief execs, chairs of boards, etc. Prior to working for DSW, my last corporate role was Director of Transformation, because my main area of speciality is in change, whether that's from an individual perspective or a strategic perspective. What else to tell you? I'm an EMCC Master Practitioner. I've spoke at conferences across Europe on subjects such as emotional intelligence, personal professional development, employee engagement, and anything really that's involved around how to get the best out of your people in order to get the best out of your business. I'm also an adjunct senior lecturer at Newcastle University Business School. So I lecture on under and post-grad degrees around managing change and personal professional development, leadership, all of those kind of areas. And my role for DSW has been to lead on the development of this particular standard and the materials that are associated with it. So we've been working really closely with some of our clients to make sure that what we produce for you is exactly what you need it to be, make sure it meets your expectations. And at the end of the day, one of the things that's really important about a standard such as this one is the curriculums can be so very, very broad. There are so many models, there are so many theories, there are so many different approaches to take to coaching professional. So we want to make sure that we work really closely with you to make sure that what we deliver, and it's not going to means at endpoint assessment stage, there are going to be no surprises. It's going to be exactly what you need it to be and what you expect it to be. If that makes sense.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Lysa. And I'll give an honorary mention to Chelsea Cottrell as well, our colleague, who's an account manager who I'm sure most of you guys will know and be familiar with. And just a big thanks to Chelsea for supporting us today. So for those of you who aren't yet familiar with DSW, because it looks from the list like there's a real mixed bag today, I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview about us as an organisation before we start. So we've been around since 1999. Working primarily originally within the financial services and banking sector, so supporting employers with resourcing, talent, things like that. And when the apprenticeship reforms came about, we were approached by a number of our clients actually who were interested in us assessing their apprentices. So we set up as an endpoint assessment organisation, and over the last 3 years, we've seen significant growth in the number of apprentices that we support and assess, and the number of employers we work with, and also the kind of breadth of standards within our portfolio. So we branched out really from financial services, and now we have a big portfolio of pan sector, so HR, leadership and management, business administration, and now coaching, which I think is going to be a real flagship product for us. We are kind of working with the Trailblazer Chair and delivering endpoint assessment for their apprentices as well, which is a really exciting opportunity. We've got a large bank of associates because of our background as a kind of resourcing consultancy firm. We've got 850, I think, associates in our pool, and of those 250 are actually also qualified assessors. So what that means is we've got the scalability to really react and respond very quickly to kind of market demand, which puts us in a strong position. And currently we work with about 120 training providers providing endpoint assessment, representing 1,700 employers. So a real mixed bag there of public sector, private sector, third. And I think when it comes to something like coaching, I think that is really going to kind of help us, because we understand that, you know, an off-the-shelf product quite often isn't the right thing when it comes to apprenticeships. The service and the product itself need to be bespoke towards the needs of different types of customer and types of user, which is why I think this particular standard's so particularly exciting to us as an organisation. Okay, so I'll hand over to Lysa now, who's going to give us a bit of an overview of the standard.
Okay, so thank you, Jake. So in terms of this particular standard, it's called a coaching professional, and I think that's really important to bear in mind. This is for somebody who, as Jake said right at the beginning, for us in coaching, it has taken us so many years to be recognised as professionals in our own right. And so it is really exciting, as Jake said, that this particular standard really recognises that, and it really works towards enabling people to become coaching professionals so that they do this as their main role. Now, that's not to say, of course, that leaders, managers and other aspiring coaches won't want to join this programme. I think it's a really great route to becoming a coaching professional, but it's also a really great opportunity for those who are already coaching professionals to get that, you know, to get something really behind them in terms of it, something formal to say that they are a coaching professional. And I think it's really important to consider that, because it means that the curriculums, of course, will reflect that. And of course, it means that our endpoint assessments will also reflect that. We're looking to make sure that at the end of the apprenticeship period, that people are fully competent to be able to be coaching professionals, which is great for us coaches. It's what we've wanted for a long time. So the other thing about the standard is, whilst it is a coaching professional, it can operate in any sector or industry. It recognises that you can be an individual, an independent coach rather, like I've been for many years, but it also recognises the breadth of different opportunities there are for coaching professionals within organisations and across any sector or industry. Typically, the standard expects you to be on programme for around 14 months. However, the minimum apprenticeship period is 12 months. So 12 to 14 months is going to be your typical on programme period. The endpoint assessment period will typically be 3 months. You can see from the slide there are 3 assessment methods. So that 3-month period needs to make sure that we give you enough time for the apprentices to go through the 3 assessment methods, which are, there will be an observation with question and answers. There'll be an interview supported by a portfolio of evidence and a knowledge test. And Jake and myself will explain in a bit more detail what those 3 assessment methods are. Okay, so let's take a look at the first one. Oh no, sorry, that's great. Thank you, Jake. So the first one then. Right, so the 3 are observation with question and answers, interview supported by portfolio of evidence, knowledge tests. So apologies, I know I've just already told you this. But the important things to know about the 3 assessment methods is actually they can be done in any order, which is great. Some other standards do actually specify that you do it in a certain order. This one doesn't, which is great news. It means we can, work much more flexibly with you to plan in the 3 assessments. The great thing about DSW is that actually after each assessment method, you will get the results of each one within 5 working days. The knowledge test is actually even quicker than that. So you will know, your apprentices will know within 5 days whether or not they've passed that particular assessment method, which is great news. It means we can be much more flexible. We can be much on the ball, much quicker on the ball, making sure your apprentices get what they need out of the endpoint assessment.
Thanks. So
let's take a look at the first one, the observation with questions and answers. So for this particular assessment method, what the assessors will be looking for is there are eight separate past descriptors that would be looking for across this assessment method to make sure that your apprentices pass this method. In addition to that, there are 5 distinction descriptors. What we do require to get a distinction is you have to get all of the 8 past descriptors and all of the 5 distinction descriptors in order to get a distinction in this method. Now, how it will work is the total length of this assessment method will be 2 hours and 20 minutes, and that will be split into 2 1-hour observations, and they have to be real observations, so real coaching sessions with different individuals. And then once those 2 observations are complete, that will be followed up by a 20-minute question and answer session. There is a 10% discretion that we can add on to that, and that's usually so that the apprentice can finish off their last answer. Within that 20-minute Q&A session, there'll be a minimum of 5 core questions. Now, we can possibly ask additional follow-up questions if needed, but there has to be a minimum of 5 core questions. What we will do is make in advance some examples of some mock questions. We'll make those available to you so you can get an idea of the kind of things that might be asked. But please do bear in mind that what our assessors will be looking for, they'll be looking for those descriptors that I've just mentioned that are mapped onto that particular assessment method. They will be looking for those, and then where there are gaps or where they need additional clarity, or where they think actually if they ask more questions, they can maybe bump them up to a distinction. So their questions will be tailored to that individual, but we will make mock questions available to give you an idea, but please be reassured those questions will be tailored to that individual for that particular assessment. They can be delivered in 3 discrete parts, so it can be spread across one working day to allow the apprentice perhaps time to get from one coaching session to another, but it must all be complete within one working day. So I'm just wondering, Jake, do we, yes, of course, I'll finish these things, but do you want people to ask questions on this particular at the end or at the end of the?
Sure, just fire them through as they come through. So there's a couple have come through there already, Lysa, if you want me to read them out.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what, why don't I'll just finish these last
slide,
cover them off. But then if people want to ask questions whilst we're on this bit, then please feel free to do so. So the observational question and answers will be delivered remotely, but if you do want, if you think it's better for your apprentice, or for the coachees, if you want that to be delivered face to face, then we are more than happy to do that. Just please get in touch with us and we'll sort out those arrangements upon request. Like I kind of touched upon earlier, it must be an observation of a real life coaching situation. This is not meant to be a role play scenario. It's not a simulation. We want to be observing real life coaching sessions. As always with these kind of things, it must be delivered in an appropriate environment. So making sure that it's free from distraction. But of course, with coaching, we know we're going to be nobody really delivers coaching in a non-appropriate environment anyway. But obviously, to make sure from our perspective, we need to make sure that certain things are in place. For example, if we are doing it remotely, we need to be able to ensure that nobody's helping the apprentice and those kind of invigilated kind of conditions. All our sessions will be recorded for quality purposes. That's very normal in the apprenticeship endpoint assessment process. That is purely just to make sure that we are standardizing things, we're doing quality assurance, but of course everything is stored securely and everything will be in line with GDPR regulations, so there's nothing to worry about with regards to that. So do we have any questions on this particular?
We do, thanks Lysa. Just a couple of things for me to add to there just before we do the questions actually. So one was around the appropriate environment, and I think one thing to be aware of is that the assessor will need to verify the ID of the apprentice. So that will be clarified in kind of the toolkit and in the emails that are sent in the lead up to that, but it's just important to be aware of that. So a photographic ID will be required just so the assessor can confirm that the apprentice is who they say they are. And the other bit, just to go back to that previous slide, actually, the timings are really tight, and these are not kind of determined by us. That's what's written into the assessment plan.
So you've got 5 core questions within that 20-minute Q&A. So you've only actually got 4 minutes for each question. So that's time for the assessor to ask the question and for the apprentice to respond. So the reason I'm telling you that and shining a light on that really is because it will help the apprentices when they're preparing and when they're doing the mocks. So they understand that if they're spending 10 minutes answering a question, they're spending too long and they're going to run out of time. So just having those numbers in mind is really important. And like Lysa said, if the apprentices have gone through the mocks and they're really familiar with those outcomes, those descriptors, they'll be able to tell when they're being asked a follow-up question. They'll be able to think, okay, maybe I didn't answer that quite as well as I could have, or actually I think that aligns very well to the distinction descriptor. So preparation is the key, and I think that's something we're probably going to hammer home quite a few times over the next half an hour or so. So questions wise, okay, so one saying, will all the elements be undertaken by the same assessor? So yes, the same assessor will carry out all of the elements of the EPA for each individual apprentices. This question, will there be a guidance statement / informed consent form which the apprentices can provide to their coachees prior to the observations taking place? I know, Lysa, you've had similar conversations around that with training providers, haven't you, in recent weeks?
Yeah, it's not necessarily stipulated in the assessment plan, but we do think it is best practice in these scenarios that you do get that, from the coachee in advance. And it's only fair, to be honest, that they know that that coaching session is going to be observed by a third party. So yes, it is best practice to make sure that you do get consent beforehand. Yes. Brilliant.
Nadia has a question, will there be a different charge for face-to-face session? So the short answer is yes, but that'll depend on a number of different factors, how many are being assessed and those sorts of things. So if you do have a requirement for a face-to-face session, just get in touch with us and we can have a discussion. And it would be basically just done on a covering costs. We wouldn't seek to make any profit from a face-to-face session. And quite a lot of questions already. I thought there might be. Another one from Jane. So can the coach use a group of coachees, or does the observation have to be an individual?
It has to be individuals. They do have to be 2 separate individuals, but it is an individual coaching session that's required.
Thanks, Lysa. Question from Alison. Can we ask about the contracting part of a coaching session? In real life, this can take considerable time, maybe even half an hour. Would you expect this to be done in full? And if so, how will that impact on the 1 hour observation?
Yeah, you'll find we've got some stuff about some top tips actually coming later. And so this is a really great question, and one we've been asked a few times. You'll see what Jake touched upon it before. Get your apprentices to make themselves really familiar with those 8 past descriptors and those distinction descriptors, because you'll be able to see what our assessors are going to be looking for. So choose really carefully which type of coaching sessions you choose as the ones to be observed, because there is one past descriptor in there, for example, all about goal setting and how will you monitor progress. So that might be a great one, for example. So when you're contracting, to be able to talk about those things, that might be a great one for that one past descriptor. But then that means for the rest of that session and the other session, you have to make sure you cover off all those other descriptors as well. So it is fine to have one of the sessions a contracting one. Just be very mindful of what those past descriptors are looking for and ensure that you're confident that within that particular session, you'll be able to cover off enough of those alongside the second session.
Thanks, Lysa. A question from Charlotte. So is the 20 minutes Q&A about both of the sessions observed? So the 2 times 1 hours come first and then finish with 1 Q&A session. Plus, if it's real life sessions with existing clients, do they have to role play contracting, as the contracting would have to be done at the start of the relationship? And unless there was a need to recontract, it wouldn't normally happen at the start of every coaching session.
Yeah. So in terms of the contracting, we're not looking for any form of role play whatsoever. So this is kind of what we're saying about, think about which sessions you choose for the observations. Because if you're not confident that if you're contracting in one of these observations, you're not confident you'll be able to cover off those the rest of the descriptors, then we'd maybe think about using an observation of a coaching session, that's second, third, or however many in. So definitely no role playing of contracting. Recontracting is potentially an interesting one. Looking at the past descriptors, it might mean that you're going to have to revisit some of the previous sessions in terms of why you're recontracting. But what we're saying is, look at the 2 sessions that you're choosing together to see whether or not you're getting the breadth of descriptors across the 2. And sorry, Jake, what was the first part of that question again?
The first part I can answer. So it's about, is it kind of 2 times 1 hour sessions and then a 20-minute Q&A? I'll let you answer it, Lysa.
Yeah, actually it is. So the 2 sessions. So if you can imagine from our assessor's point of view, what we're looking for is that breadth of those pass and distinction descriptors across those 2 sessions. We're looking ideally for the apprentice to cover off as many of those as possible. Then once those 2 observations are complete, that's when the 20-minute Q&A will come in. And that's really the assessor's role there, is to look for what has not been covered, ideally not much, maybe get clarity where something's borderline, and potentially use that time to ask a little bit more depth on some of the questions to see whether or not we can bump the apprentice up to a distinction.
Thanks, Lysa. Just a question for you, which you might not know the answer to now, and it's a follow-up really, I think, from me to Alison and Charlotte. So is it a requirement, is it acceptable rather in these 2 1-hour observations then to not address contracting at all?
There is nothing at all within the assessment plan that says you have to or you don't have to.
Okay.
So in my view, that would be to just pay attention. So what's really interesting is if you look at the KSBs, the knowledge, skills and behaviours that are associated with assessment method, they do go into detail around areas such as contracting, but the past descriptors don't actually say that they're looking specifically at contracting. Now, I think that actually is a real advantage for the apprentice, because it means that they're able to choose sessions that they feel can best evidence those particular past descriptors based on the current clients or coachees that they're working with. So I think it's an advantage, not a disadvantage.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lysa. And then a question from Rachel. Do you make arrangements regarding the date for the observations and send diary invites as the training provider? So Rachel, the way that would work would be once the apprentice has gone through Gateway and their Gateway documentation has been approved, you will be contacted by the assessor, as in the training provider. So whoever's named on the EPA Pro system as the apprentice's coach, that person will be contacted by our assessor, and then they'll put in a planning meeting. And in that planning meeting, that's when you'll agree all of the dates of the sessions and things like that. Usually the planning meeting is just between the coach and our assessor. However, I can't see any reason why, if it was going to make it easier to arrange and facilitate, that the apprentice couldn't be part of that as well. So I think that's it for the questions for now. Yep, that's it for now. So we'll move on to the next section. Thank you. Okay. So next is the second assessment method, which is an interview which is supported by a portfolio of evidence. So for this method, there are 6 past descriptors and there are 3 distinction descriptors. And as with the previous method, in order to pass this particular assessment, the apprentice needs to meet all 6 of those past descriptors in full. And if they want to get a distinction, they need to meet all of the past descriptors and meet all of the distinction descriptors. And it's important to note that we're talking about pass and distinction descriptors here and not KSBs. So the standard itself, as with any apprenticeship standard, the foundation for it are a set of KSBs, so the knowledge, skills and behaviour statements. But when it comes to the assessment of the observation and the interview, what the assessor is actually marking the apprentice against are those past descriptors and distinction descriptors. So those descriptors are based on the KSBs, but if I were preparing an apprentice for this assessment, I would be encouraging them not to look at the KSBs, but to look at those past descriptors, because that's ultimately what the assessor is going to have in front of them when they're carrying out that assessment. So if the apprentice knows those descriptors inside out and they've got a good 14 months to prepare and familiarise themselves with them, they're going to have a much better experience and a much better chance of coming away with a good outcome. So I can't kind of emphasise that point enough. The portfolio itself is not actually formally assessed, so it will be submitted at Gateway along with the English and Maths and all of the other stuff. And then it's reviewed by the independent assessor in the lead up to the interview. So it's not actually formally assessed. However, it does remain a really important component and something that the apprentice should put quite a lot of effort into, because what it does is it provides the examples and it provides the context to the independent assessor for them to formulate the questions for the interview. And so if you've got a really good portfolio and it's well mapped and there are things like witness testimonies in there, you're giving the independent assessor a lot of information and a lot of context and a lot of lenses through which to observe the apprentice's competence in their activities. And that just lends itself to a much richer experience in the interview. Whereas conversely, if you had a very poor portfolio and the assessor that felt, well, actually, I don't really think that this meets the outcomes particularly well, within that interview, they're going to be saying, okay, well, give me another example. And the apprentice is going to have to be providing the scenario and the context and building it up from scratch. So I say the same thing, to be honest, every webinar, every session I do where there's a non-assessed portfolio, and I'm a bit like a broken record, but it is really, really important. That putting the effort in is just as important as if it were an assessed portfolio. And I know that whenever I do speak to training providers and coaches and quality people, they always share that view. Quite often we'll say, you know, we will emphasize to the apprentices that the portfolio is really important. The portfolio itself, so the assessment plan says that there'll be 10 to 15 pieces of evidence within it. Now, a piece of evidence might be one solitary document, or a piece of evidence might actually be, say, a statement that's got a number of different bits of evidence that support it. So it might be, say, a folder, and within that folder you have kind of a scenario, so a description of something that the apprentice dealt with or did, and then there might be a few emails in it that underpin that, or there might be some copies of a presentation that they did, or some minutes from a meeting, and those types of product evidence. So 10 to 15 pieces, but a piece might be one single big piece of evidence, or it might be a folder with kind of a few different little pieces in it. One piece of evidence can cover multiple outcomes, and actually quite often a good piece of evidence will cover multiple outcomes. One thing that you guys will have noticed in this and in other newer assessment plans that have these non-assessed portfolios is there's a statement in there that says that the portfolio should not contain any form of self-reflection. The difference with the coaching is that obviously coaching requires self-reflection in order to be a coach. So there is a kind of exception in there. So for B1, so that's the behavior statement, you can actually, and indeed you need to include some self-reflection. So that's exempt from that rule. So I'm just going to focus on that idea of reflection and reflection accounts just for a moment, because we get asked this question a lot. So traditionally, historically, within the portfolio, what we've always encouraged, and I think what's always really helped to build a good portfolio, is what we might have called a reflective account. It wasn't really a reflective account. What it is kind of a summary statement of something the apprentice did. And quite often it's something particularly impressive or complex, like dealing with a complaint, changing a particular process, dealing with a particularly difficult issue where you might have had to use emotional intelligence, different systems and processes, liaise with different departments, and really keep people informed through effective communication. So those types of accounts are still really important, I would say, and I would encourage you to include them. Now, Lysa and I had a conversation about this actually and said, well, let's retain those documents, but we won't call them reflective accounts. We call them something else, like, say, a summary statement. Because what they do is they help the apprentice to kind of remember what they did, really, and refresh the memory of it. But they also really help the assessor because they provide the context to the evidence. Otherwise, what you get is a folder with loads of bits of emails in and stuff. And without the story that kind of pulls all of that evidence together, it often either doesn't make sense or isn't that compelling. Whereas a combination of the apprentice's written account of what they did, here's the evidence to back up that my account is accurate. And actually, here's a witness testimony from a line manager that says it was accurate, and this is their view of how I performed in that particular instance. That is a good portfolio, and that's exactly the sort of thing that we're looking for. So don't be put off by that statement about reflective accounts. Do continue to encourage apprentices to include some form of written statement about what evidence they've put in. And it might even just be a sheet of A4 that says, okay, this is the evidence, this is why I've included it. Just something to give that extra layer of context, really helpful.
And then the final point on the interview is that it's by default delivered remotely. So typically use a platform like WebEx or Zoom or Teams. We do have a number of different platforms available because we recognize different employers have different preferences, certain firewalls, things like that. So we are quite flexible in relation to which platforms used. But again, as with the other method, if you have apprentices who prefer to be assessed face-to-face, that can be facilitated as well. Okay, just a few more points on the interview then, and I'll just check in to see if we have any more questions. Quick check of time, we're on 10:35. I think because we've answered quite a lot of questions as we've gone through, obviously we've gone a little bit over, but we've got until 11 or beyond if we need to. So the interview itself is 60 minutes in duration. And again, you've got that 10% discretion for the assessor. And like Lysa said before, that is usually if the apprentice is answering the final question. It's just so that the assessor doesn't have to cut them off kind of midstream. The interview will consist of 6 open questions. So they will be taken from a bank of questions that we give to the assessors, but the assessors will be permitted to kind of tweak the questions depending on what they've seen in the portfolio, so that they're not just totally generic questions. They are actually tailored towards the work that the apprentice has actually done and submitted. And again, there are follow-up questions that the assessor might ask at their discretion. So I'll say that same thing again that I've already said a few times. Familiarity with those descriptors is really important, because if the apprentice knows them inside out and you've done mocks with them, they're going to know when they're being asked a follow-up question. They're instinctively going to be able to tell, and they're going to know whether it's, okay, maybe I didn't answer it quite right, or maybe I'm being pressed for a distinction here. So preparation, preparation, preparation. So last couple of points. So there's a referencing table for the interview, for the portfolio rather, which is included in the toolkit. So the apprentice must use that, but it helps them because it helps them to ensure that they've got enough evidence there to cover all of the outcomes in full. And then mock questions are available. So the toolkit's available now, but Lysa's working on mock questions for each of the individual assessment methods, and she has been liaising with clients directly just to make sure that we get those right in terms of the pitch and the language and things like that. So if there's anybody on the call, or indeed kind of watching this video in the next week or so, who would like to be part of that, do get in touch, and by all means we'll share that with you, because we really like consulting on these types of things and getting feedback rather than just kind of designing them, putting them out there and hoping that they work. I think the collaborative approach is far more effective. So talked for a long time there. I'll take a deep breath and then I'll just check if there are any questions. Okay, so question from Jane: when will the descriptors be available? So Jane, the toolkit is finished now. It should be on EPA Pro. If it's not, I'll make sure it's on there by the end of the week. And the descriptors are all in there. They're also actually in the assessment plan. So I think one of the beauties of this plan, and a lot of the newer plans that have been published recently, is that for each of the assessment methods, the descriptors are pre-prescribed. So it's really clear to the apprentice and indeed to their employer and their coach exactly what's going to need to be covered. So make use of the fact that you have that transparency is my main tip there. So it's all in the toolkit, and it's in the assessment plan as well.
Would you mind, could I just add something into that as well?
Yeah, sure, of course.
So when you get what you find with the toolkit is embedded within the toolkit is something that we've called a mapping document. So what we've done is we've taken, as Jake's just described there, we've taken those descriptors from the assessment plan, we've mapped it on to the individual assessment methods, but we've also mapped the KSB, so the knowledge, skills and behaviour learning outcomes, as they're often called. We've mapped those to each assessment method as well. So whilst Jake's quite right in terms of making sure your apprentices are familiar with those pass and distinction descriptors, but when it comes to choosing, for example, when we were talking before about which coaching sessions should be observed, or indeed what type of evidence could be included to demonstrate those pass and distinction descriptors, that's when your KSBs become really useful. Because the way it will be mapped within the document that we're providing will give some potential context to how you might want to demonstrate those past descriptors. So they've been mapped all together to give a really rich both the depth and the breadth of context for each assessment method, to give your apprentices the best opportunity to be able to meet those past descriptors. So that's available within the toolkit that Jake's just been describing.
Thanks, Lysa. And just a couple of final questions from Nadia there. So first one, I think I've answered, so how long does it last? So 60 minutes. And then the other one is, so contextualization statement instead of reflective accounts. So yeah, I think contextualization statement is how I would describe it really. It's a couple of options with that as I see it, and we will provide some further guidance actually around kind of what that might look like. But it's either a statement describing an activity, which might be kind of 3 or 4 sides of A4, it might just be a couple of sides, which then has product evidence hung on to it, if you like, or simply a statement saying, okay, within this folder, I've got 5 pieces of evidence. Evidence piece 1 is this email. Why have I included it? Right, I've included it because. So sort of doing it that way around. Either way, I think would be fine.
And Jake, if I may, can I just add another point to that as well? When you look at the past descriptors and the distinction descriptors actually for the interview in particular, you'll notice they nearly all start with explain or describe. So it's given you a real opportunity to be able to demonstrate knowledge and, you know, the knowledge that they have around contracting or, you know, things like that. So it's not always going to be necessary actually to provide any form of reflection within some of these things, because you'll see from the past descriptors, it's actually need to explain or describe why certain things are important. So Jake, you know, it's absolutely, when you look at B1, for example, if I give you, if I just bring that up as an example quickly, she says, I'm just trying to find it and can't. B1 is talking specifically about explain with examples how they perform reflection. So the way the past descriptors are written actually lends itself to be able to quite easily give some really good evidence for those. And the summary statements or the contextualization statements, yes, they're great to provide context for the apprentice, for the assessor, but you'll find making yourself familiar with those past descriptors, they lend themselves really nicely to be able to show what kind of evidence you need to provide, so that they are written quite well, actually.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Lysa. So I'm going to move on to now the third and final assessment method, which is the knowledge test. And this is probably the simplest of the 3, to be honest. So it's a multiple choice question paper with a total of 40 questions in it. The knowledge test covers 9 of those individual knowledge statements. So this is the only one of the 3 methods that doesn't have the past descriptors or distinction descriptors. It's based purely upon kind of those knowledge statements. So again, it's within the toolkit in the document that Lysa just spoke about. It does tell you very clearly kind of what will be covered. There will be a mock knowledge test that's available as well, both as a paper-based test and on the question mark system, where the apprentice will ultimately set the live test. And the format of the test is that there are 30 standalone MCQs, and there are 10 which are scenario based. So within the test, there'll be 2 scenarios, and each of those scenarios has 5 questions associated to it. The apprentice has 90 minutes to complete the test in total. And it's done online, like I said before, using the question mark system. So question mark has remote invigilation as part of it. So you're not required to provide invigilators, and it can be delivered kind of 24/7 in any kind of appropriate environment where the apprentice has access to the technology that they need. It's a closed book test, so it is done in kind of controlled exam conditions. So the apprentice needs to be in a room where they can pan the camera around, just so that the invigilator can check the environment's appropriate and there aren't any aides there or any people there that can interfere with the process. And again, they need to check the ID of the apprentice and all of those sorts of things. As I mentioned, the mock questions are available, and with the mocks, there's a mark scheme as well, so that you can mark and score your apprentices to see how well they've performed in the mock. And in order to pass the knowledge test, the apprentice needs to score between 26 and 34. And in order to gain a distinction, they need to score 35 or more. Okay, I'm just going to check if there are any questions on the knowledge test before we move on. So question, will the knowledge test questions be different for every apprentice? So we will provide a bank of tests, and so it will be randomized, so the apprentices won't know which version of the test they're going to sit.
And if the apprentice sits the test and fails it, the next time they sit, they will get a different test with different questions in. And if they failed again, in the unlikely event that that happened, then they'll be given a different test again. Okay. So question from Charlotte, are the mock tests available now? So I'm going to hand that over to you, Lysa, because I know you've been working on them for some time. And again, it's something you've been consulting with clients on, isn't it, to make sure that we get the pitch right?
Yeah, they're not available just yet. We are hoping to get everything ready by, what did we agree, Jake, by the end of September.
Yeah.
The reason why this has taken a little bit longer is because from working with clients, we've noticed that the breadth of curriculum topics are really, really broad. So what we've got to be very careful of is that we're not including questions that potentially might not be covered in your curriculum. Now, it's such a broad topic, and that's going to be quite a challenge. So we're just trying to work with as many providers as we can, checking in with the curriculums, seeing what kind of models, theories, tools are being covered across most of them to make sure that we are not disadvantaging your apprentices in any way. So unlike some other standards, like say, for example, in the financial sector, where legislation, regulation, etc., is black and white, this is much broader. So it is taking us a tiny bit longer, but we think that's really important that we work with you to get it right. So, but we are hoping to get those available by the end of September. Have I got those skills right, Jake?
Yeah, you did. Yeah, and that's a really important point that you've made there about the models, actually. And again, if there are people that are on the call now and you would like to be part of that conversation, let us know, because when we've had similar standards with an MCQ type assessment in the past, so for example, operations departmental manager, what we've done is we've gone out to training providers and said, you tell us which models you're teaching. And then what we've done is we've kind of picked out the ones that are the most common, the most popular, and then put them into the test rather than picking quite obscure ones, because it's not fair on the apprentices. You know, they've gone through their program and then they're assessed on something they've had no exposure to through no fault of their own. And that's why apprenticeships are a bit unusual, because as an assessment body, we're assessing something for which we didn't actually design the curriculum. So Lysa's quite right, we want to get that right. So if we haven't spoken to you about this and you'd like to be part of it, do get in touch, because we want to make sure that we know which are the most common models that you guys are teaching. And then so if we do assess any models as part of that MCQ, we'll focus on those common ones. And what we can also do is actually list those as well for the sake of transparency, so that when you prepare an apprentices, you can say, okay, you can't guarantee what's going to come up in the test, obviously. However, you may be assessed on any or all of the following models, just for absolute transparency, really. Question from Alison, can they go back to questions that they've passed on? Yes, they can. So before they click kind of complete the test, they can go through and they can check all of their answers and go back on any that they didn't answer. Question again from Alison, going back to the reflective accounts and contextualized statements, you said that there'll be some guidance to come out about that. When do you expect that to be? It's a good question, Alison. So I am working with my team in DSW to provide a whole load of guidance, to be honest, around portfolios in particular, just to try and bring some consistency towards kind of the approaches that are taken to mapping and referencing and all those sorts of things. And then within that, we'll include some guidance around the reflective accounts. So realistically speaking, I think it's probably going to be October when we release that. I had hoped to do it in September, but it's actually quite an enormous piece of work and I want to make sure that we get it right. So certainly in October, we will release quite a lot of guidance around portfolios, and that'll be included within the Alison. Questions still coming in thick and fast by the looks of it, so I'm just going to work through a couple more and then we'll move on. Okay, so great. Steve said he's happy to be part of the conversation, read the curriculum. So thanks, Steve. That's brilliant. Same from Jane. Excellent. So Chelsea, I'm not sure if you're able to capture these, but what I would say is, oh, you are right. That's great. Thanks, Chelsea. That's perfect. Okay. One from Jeanette as well, which to pick up on Lysa, she'd like to catch up on launching the program this week.
Great.
Okay. That's it for now. So I'm going to just move on to the next section, which I think I'm happy to cover grading, Lysa, if you want to kind of finish off with the top tips in the Q&A.
Okie doke.
Yep.
Brilliant. So the grading is quite straightforward, actually, because it's all set out in the assessment plan. So you've got 3 assessment methods, and each one is graded individually. So it's not like a holistic assessment where you can pick up extra grades for the observation and the interview. Each one is graded individually. So in order to pass, the apprentice has to pass each of the 3 methods. And in order to gain a distinction, they need to gain a distinction in each of the 3 methods. And it couldn't be any more straightforward. So within each method, within the observation and the interview, they have to meet all the pass descriptors to get a pass. They have to also meet all the distinction descriptors to get a distinction. And for your knowledge tests, you've got a threshold for a pass and a threshold for a distinction. So to get a pass, the apprentice has to pass all 3 methods. To get a distinction, they have to get a distinction in all 3 methods. So if they get 2 distinctions in a pass, that's still just a pass. If the apprentice fails one or more of the methods and they resit, their final grade will be capped at a pass overall. If the apprentice fails the observation, there'll be a different set of questions asked within the Q&A section of that when they resit it. And then the final point, again, taken from the assessment plan, is that any resits or retakes have to be taken within 3 months of the fail notification being given for that individual method. I can't really see that being an issue for any apprentices. Quite a long period of time. So I'm going to hand over to the expert now to give you some of their top tips and then answer any final questions that we might have. Over to you, Lysa.
I think we've covered a lot of these, actually.
We have.
Yeah. So, yeah, in fact, we have done with most of them. So, like we've said at the beginning, in terms of the observation, that particular assessment method, really pay attention to those pass and distinction criteria and have a look at which particular coachees your apprentice is working with, where you know that next session coming up or the one that you're choosing is going to give them the best opportunity to demonstrate the required breadth of pass and distinction descriptors. And as Jake's mentioned throughout, familiarity with those descriptors is absolutely key, because whether that's in choosing your observations, whether that's in choosing your portfolio evidence, or whether that's being prepared for your interview, understanding what they are is going to give you give your apprentices the best opportunity to do their absolute very best in those assessments. We will provide a range of materials. Those mock assessments and various guidance we're literally working on them as we speak. Obviously, I suppose it's so reassuring to see so many people want to be involved in making sure we get that right. What that might mean is that might extend that time period somewhat if we're working with more people to get it right. But our target is to get those out by the end of September. But we will give loads of information to support you and your apprentices in the best possible way that we can. One of the other things we would say is, in particular to the observations, making yourselves familiar with those, or making the apprentices familiar with those descriptors is really important. Try and plan as many of those in the actual observations as you can. Now, I fully appreciate when you're working in a coaching scenario, you never quite know how that session's going to go. And I appreciate that might feel a little bit scary, because how can you predict what the other person's going to do and say, etc.? Give it your best shot. Have a real think about what's going to give you the best chance to bring as many of those as you can, so that that last 20 minutes Q&A is potentially only used, as Jake mentioned right at the beginning, it's not long. 20 minutes for 5 questions, a minimum of 5 questions is not long. Our assessors ideally, if there's loads of gaps in the past descriptors over the 2 observations, bear in mind that 20 minutes is going to be used plugging gaps. So get as many as you can in across the sessions and get your apprentices to use that 20 minutes so that our assessors can look for any additional clarity if something's borderline, or to give them the best opportunity to maybe dive a little bit deeper and bump them up to a distinction. So really thinking about that's very, very important. I think Jake's already covered, although the portfolio isn't assessed, it's extremely important. If you imagine the assessors will, although they're not assessing the portfolio, but they are going to be reviewing that portfolio in advance of that interview, and then they will design their interview questions based on potential gaps in the portfolio, or like I've just mentioned earlier, to gain clarity whether something's a borderline pass. But ideally, the best portfolio you can provide is going to give the interview the best chance of that assessor looking for maybe getting them up to a distinction. So it's really, really important because it will determine what questions the assessors will ask during that interview. And practice makes perfect. Now that seems a really obvious thing to say, but one of the questions we've been asked quite a lot is how many coaching hours are we expecting to have the apprentice to have covered during the apprenticeship? Now you'll notice if you've had a look if anybody's looked at the assessment plan, it's not actually mandated. We've been asked this question a lot. We've spoke to various different professionals and clients and employers and training providers, and there does seem to be quite a broad view of how many hours is, you should be doing across that apprenticeship. So that's not for us to mandate, but what we would say is, this is, just to remind you, this is a coaching professional apprenticeship. So this is working towards somebody who will be a professional coach. And to be a professional coach, we are probably expecting that they will be getting a number of coaching hours in. They're not just doing it every now and again as an add-on, perhaps, to their job. So in regards to that, for employers in particular, you must make sure that your apprentices are getting the opportunity to get as many coaching sessions in as possible, because practices really does make perfect here. We're wanting to support your apprentices to do the best they can. So make sure they get as many coaching hours in as they possibly can, so they can really demonstrate how competent they are when it comes to that end point assessment period.
Thank you, Lysa. It's really helpful. So we've got a few final questions, I think, that have come in, which I think we're on the Q&A section now anyway, so that's perfect. So one from Nadia: will the interview and observation be undertaken by the same assessor? So they will, Nadia, yeah. The same assessor will do the observation and Q&A and the interview. They'll review the portfolio as well and then issue the final grade. If an element of the retake is not undertaken within 3 months, will they have to redo the whole EPA? Unfortunately, the answer to that's yes. And again, that's not a DSW rule. That's something that's written into the assessment plan. And here's the killer question, which I think relates to the point you just made there, Lysa, actually. So in terms of the right learner for the standard, we have some employers who want leaders and managers to undertake the standard. So coaching isn't their main role, but forms part of their role. Would they be suitable and able to complete the EPA with enough exposure to pass?
I think from my perspective, that has to be passed back to the employer, because if the employer wants to put, and it's understandable why leaders and managers, why employers would want the leaders and managers to be put through this, and I do understand that. But in terms of expectation, it is about having that conversation to go, they must be given appropriate, type of exposure to be able to meet the exactly as the question asks, to be able to complete the EPA successfully. And I think, one of the guidelines to look at some of the professional bodies like the EMCC, look at the kind of requirements to become members of the coaching profession, use perhaps some of those as guidance, as standards, but it is important. I would say we have to put that, because it's not mandated in the assessment plan. We can't mandate the number of hours. You have to have those conversations with the employers. If they want to invest in this standard and they want their employees to pass, they have to be able to give them the appropriate, amount of exposure. Jake, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I would absolutely agree with what you've said there, Lysa. And I think it kind of lends itself, I think, to the point I made right at the start of the initial hesitancy, I guess, from, I think it was Biz at the time, before IFATE even existed, who wouldn't approve the standard because this was exactly what they feared. But the devil's in the detail, really, and I think it is down to the commitment of the employer to give the exposure to those apprentices, so the genuine kind of coaching hours. So I was reading that question and trying to answer it in the context of myself, and if I were to do a coaching apprenticeship and actually I think I would be eligible. And hand on heart, I think with my current role, maybe not, because coaching is a part of it, but it's not kind of an integral part of it. So I think in order for me to be eligible for the program, I think I would need to reshape my role. And I did have a conversation actually with a training provider fairly recently about this, and an employer they're working with who have kind of fairly large cohorts where they are actually changing the job descriptions and the job titles even of the people that they're putting on these programs. So there's some existing members of staff who are transforming into more kind of coaching based roles rather than kind of HR or leadership.
So I think if the will's there from the employers to make those changes that, you know, give the apprentices the exposure, then it's doable. But what I would say is, if you think you've got an opportunity there, or you're working with an employer and you're not certain, get in touch with us and we'll have a conversation. I think that's absolutely the best thing, the best approach to take, and then we can give you our kind of candid, honest appraisal of it and then work from there. And then a final question on here from Kathy. So we have apprentices that are due to complete in November, but we don't have all the info we need for them to prepare for their assessment yet. It's still being created. How might this affect us as we are running out of time to adapt or implement some potential requirements? Okay, Kathy, so if you want to kind of pick up with me separately, what we can do is, we do have the stuff there. So we've got the mocks and things like that. And like Lysa said, it's kind of it. What we're doing at the moment is really tweaking them and recalibrating them based on feedback that we're getting. But if you have apprentices for whom EP is imminent, there are absolutely a host of resources that are there that we can get out to you pretty quickly, to be honest. So do get in touch and we'll help you with that.
And I think just to add on to that, the toolkit is available now. I think, Jake, you said if it's not an EP Pro, we'll get that out by the end of the week. Within that toolkit, there's lots more information based on what we've discussed today, but also that mapping document is key. That's really, that's probably the key document, I would say, that will support your learners or your apprentices. But in addition to that, the referencing table is in there, so they can already start mapping their evidence for the portfolio. So I think in terms of that, we can get that out by the end of this week at the latest, I think. Is that what you said before, Jake?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Thanks, Lysa. Okay, I'm just going to check in the chat because I know there's some questions in Q&A and some in chat. I think that's it actually for now, unless there are any other questions to come through. How are we doing for time? Bang on 11 o'clock, not bad. Brilliant. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I'll just say a massive thank you to everyone for attending and expressing an interest. I'll reiterate what I said at the start. I think of any apprenticeship I've ever been involved in, I'm more excited about this one than I am any other, just because it's been so long in the making and it is going to really transform a profession. I think that deserves the recognition, and we all have an opportunity here to be part of something really exciting, and I'm really pleased to see the appetite for collaboration as well from the chat and from the conversations that we've had. So a massive thank you to everybody who's attended, a massive thank you to Lysa for all of the kind of support and developing this up to now, and obviously supporting today, and to Chelsea and to our friends at Keen as well for helping us to actually facilitate the webinar. I feel like an Oscars speech.
You're not getting a trophy, Jake.
No, never do. Anything final thoughts, comments from you, Lysa?
No, just absolutely. I would just reiterate everything Jake's just said. For me personally, as a coaching professional, it is just such an exciting opportunity that finally something's going to be out there that's going to really be able to support people to be coaching professionals. So I'm really grateful to DSW for allowing me to be involved, but I've really enjoyed in particular working with DSW's clients. So I'm really excited about working with the people that have already expressed an interest, because let's get this right. Let's get it brilliant, and let's get some excellent coaching professionals out there, which would be brilliant.
Fabulous. Thank you very much indeed, Lysa, and everybody else, and have a brilliant day.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.